Hi, everyone. Welcome to the third and last seminar of the fall quarter this year. And it's my pleasure to introduce Joe Castiglione as our next speaker. He's the Deputy Director of Transportation Data and Analysis at the San Francisco County and Transportation Authority. And prior to joining the Transportation Authority, he worked as a consultant for transportation market research and transportation engineering firms. He has a bachelor degree from Yale and a Master of City Planning degree from UC Berkeley. And he has led many efforts to integrate the advanced travel demand simulation with traffic models and dynamic traffic models. And recently, he has been leading the Transportation Authority research into the potential of effects of transportation network companies, or TNCs, in San Francisco. And its effects on congestion, transit ridership, and equity. And today's presentation is precisely on that and TNCs and data. And because it's a small group, but we want to keep our time we will try to finish promptly at 11 or maybe some minutes earlier. We will ask to write down the questions in the chat box, and we will go over them after when the presentation ends, sorry, around 10:30. But we encourage you to have your cameras on later on the discussion, and so that we can all talk right now. So Joe, the floor is all yours.
Great, let me share my screen. This presentation I'm calling Transportation Network Companies and Data. I will cover a bunch of the topics that go beyond just the data, including the effects of TNCs on congestion and on transit ridership, and looking at equity. But I wanted to also focus on data because really that has been one of the primary challenges that we have had in grappling with both the opportunities and impacts that TNCs present in San Francisco. What I'd like to do first, and I'll try not to spend too much time on this, but it is tell you first a little bit about what the San Francisco County Transportation Authority is. That's the agency I work for. The questions that we wanted to answer, how we went about trying to get data to answer the questions, what were some of our findings, and then maybe some thoughts on why, how and why agencies need to get and manage data effectively to answer these questions. I think one of the things that's challenging right now is, of course, and what you'll see here is a lot of this work was completed prior to, the kind of current COVID era, which has obviously, radically impacted transportation system demand and performance. I won't be addressing COVID questions directly, but if folks at somewhat later in the questions, we want to talk a bit about that. We are doing a bunch of work around that, and I can share with you some of the stuff that we've been doing. So what is the San Francisco County Transportation Authority? Well, we were originally founded or created when voters in San Francisco elected to tax themselves a half-cent to fund transportation improvements. And so we were kind of initially like a fiduciary or a financial kind of agency. But our role has grown in the almost 30 years since we were first founded. And that's included taking on one very particularly important role, which is we're the congestion management agency for San Francisco County. And as the congestion management agency for San Francisco County, we actually have a lot of requirements that we have to fulfill. Every 2 years, we monitor congestion. We have been for about the last 30 years. If we, in monitoring congestion, find that there are deficiencies arising on the roadway network, we have to develop plans to kind of mitigate those. We also take the lead in managing and programming funds from the federal, state, and local levels at the regional kind of competition level. And we also developed the long-range transportation plan for the city and county of San Francisco. I should say that the kind of cadence of our network monitoring and congestion monitoring has picked up. A process that we used to go through every other year, we now do every week. And so we actually have kind of sustained and ongoing, not quite real time, but pretty up-to-date information on how travel trends have been changing in San Francisco. And as I said before, one of the main roles we have is managing the sales tax revenues. So One of the questions that we were faced early on, and this was something that arose, I would say about 2016 or so, a lot of our commissioners began to ask questions about TNCs. And so just for clarification, our commissioners are actually the Board of Supervisors for San Francisco County. And so they're the main decision makers, in addition to the mayor for San Francisco. And a lot of them were coming to us and saying, in San Francisco, it seems like there were, and this is again circa about 2016, 2017, it seems like there's a lot of TNCs on the street, but how many are there, and what are the effects? And one of the challenges we had is that due to some rulemaking at the statewide level, although typically jurisdictions like cities have managed and regulated fleets for hire fleets such as taxis, back around 2012, 2013, the state legislature designated the California Public Utilities Commission as the folks who would regulate TNCs throughout the state. So kind of wresting that local for hire vehicle management from the local level to the state level. As a consequence of that, there were some pretty strong data reporting requirements that the CPUC required, and I'll talk about these a little bit later, but none of that data was being shared. The CPUC was saying that basically, yes, we have this data, but it's really not of any kind of public interest. And of course, that's really a bit troubling. I mean, it would be troubling under any circumstance, but especially so because around this time, as we all know, there was just really a lot of change going on. TNCs and other, we'll call them maybe disruptive, maybe new mobility, transportation technologies were all coming online, but we had no idea what was happening. And of course, when you're in these periods of rapid change, data is really more important than ever. It's so that we can, do better planning, make policies that are appropriate, provide, accountability over different industries. And there are really risks to public policy making without transparent data. The risk, of course, is that we're going to make, poor decisions, and those poor decisions may be everything from affecting people's lives and livelihoods to essentially wasting money. On the right here, you see like a typical, kind of a representation of the kind of growth in new markets, where, early on, maybe there's slow adoption. We don't know quite what's going to happen. Then there's a period of rapid adoption, and then the market becomes saturated and growth seems to, kind of plateau. We really, in circa 2016, 2017, had no idea where we were on this curve. Were we at the, the far left-hand side and there was going to be explosive growth, or were we at the right-hand side where perhaps the growth had maximized? So we really wanted to be able to track some of this information. So, I think whenever we talk about data, it's really important to have a set of questions that you want to answer for everyone's sake. We don't want to just go out and collect data that ultimately doesn't have a very explicit and identified purpose. So we tried to have a very specific set of questions that we were trying to answer. And those questions were primarily focused on what are the existing conditions circa 2016, 2017? How many TNCs were operating on San Francisco streets? How many trips were occurring? When and where are these trips occurring? How much VMT are TNCs generating? Of course, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the fact that VMT is now one of the main metrics for assessing environmental quality impacts in the state of California. And also addressing things like equity, like are TNCs providing reasonable and consistent coverage throughout the entire city? We had some even more so specific questions about, how much are TNCs potentially affecting roadway congestion? To what extent are TNCs competing with or complementing transit? Are TNCs available to all sorts of different San Francisco residents? Is street safety being impacted by TNCs? And maybe at a higher level, really, what is the role of government in attempting to regulate TNCs? So what types of data were we really interested in? Well, we're interested typically in a wide range of data, and it's important when we think about something like looking at TNCs that TNCs are really just one part of a very large and complicated transportation market, that includes travel by all sorts of modes, whether it's walking or transit or personal vehicles, but also travel for non-personal purposes, commercial, freight, deliveries. All of those are things that we are interested in getting information on. So a lot of the information that we collect, and this is not just limited to TNCs, are inventories of assets and descriptions of transportation networks, be they roadway, non-motorized, transit, et cetera. We're keenly interested in network performance measures, and that's what we do a lot with our CMP, where we are monitoring roadway volumes and speeds and travel time reliability in a multimodal way. It's not just focused on vehicular traffic, but also looking at transit and bike and ped. We're really interested in, of course, the demand for travel. Where and when are trips occurring by different modes, and who's using those and undertaking those trips and for what purposes. Demographic information is, of course, we're super interested in this because we're looking at all of the questions that we face and the policies and the decisions that we have to make through an inequity lens is really in the kind of genes of our agency, and we try to bring that equity lens to all of the work that we do. But of course, I mentioned earlier that the SFCTA is also about making, one of our roles is to help make policy and to guide investments. And those policies and investments are typically intended to help influence the travel choices that people make. So how do people make trade-offs between different travel choices they may have, between modes, between time of day, for different purposes, and so on. So our decision makers were asking us this question like, hey, you really have to help us understand what's going on with TNCs. But unfortunately, there was almost no data that was available at the time. As I said, the CPUC was collecting very detailed data, or I should say very detailed data was being reported to the CPUC, but they weren't sharing any of that data with us. I inserted this next slide because there is a little bit of an update to that, which is that in the intervening years since we first started this work, there has been, I think, some very positive movement on behalf or on the part of the California Public Utilities Commission. As I said, they're the statewide agency that regulates TNCs here in California. And from the earliest inception of that role, they were actually getting detailed trip level records. Basically, every TNC trip that's being taken in the state was being reported to the CPUC. It was actually quite fine-grained with respect to the temporal detail, with individual kind of timestamps. It was a little bit aggregate at the spatial level, it was at a zip code level. But again, none of this data was being made available to any public agency due to concerns or claims of trade secrets and personal privacy concerns. However, as I said, I think there has been some very positive movement more recently. There's been a multi-year, I think it's been going on for at least 5 years now, TNC data track, and the commission, the California Public Utilities Commission, has recently kind of revised their take on the trade secrets and privacy exclusions, and have indicated that in fact those claims, while in some very specific instances may have merit, generally the data should be made publicly available. We haven't seen any of it yet, but we're cautiously optimistic that we will at some point. In addition, there's been legislation that looked at, for example, the provision of wheelchair access vehicles, again, a critical equity concern across the state. This was the Access for All legislation that does involve some data reporting. And in fact, for the first time, in fact, just this week, we first received detailed information just on the number of trips that were being requested and made or fulfilled for wheelchair access vehicles for all the counties throughout the state. And again, very encouraging work. Right now, automated vehicles, AVs, have been, up to this point, been allowed to drive on California public streets under permits that were issued by the DMV. But the California Public Utilities Commission also has the right to kind of manage and regulate the deployment of AVs more broadly on California streets for basically passenger service, where they can start to take passengers around, the public around, they can charge fares, they can have shared rides. So very much looking like a TNC model. And again, the CPUC has been much more amenable to requiring the AV companies to transparently report information, again, at an aggregate level, about their operations. So much of what you're going to see before describes the kind of contortions that we needed to do to get data a few years ago. But there is, again, I think we have reason for some cautious optimism that perhaps that's changing as we move into the future. So, given the inability to get data from the state, how did the San Francisco County Transportation Authority get data to start to answer some of these key questions around TNCs? Well, what we did was we partnered with some researchers at Northeastern University, some computer scientists there. They scraped the data from the Uber and Lyft APIs. So what that means is they actually developed a set of actually synthetic users, not real people, but scripts essentially that would go out and ping the APIs of Uber and Lyft for a set of hypothetical geographic locations throughout San Francisco County every few seconds. And when you ping the API, it would return the nearest, the breadcrumbs, the telemetry data for the nearest 8 vehicles. And it was, again, this was done for about every 5 seconds for a 6-week period, generated about 12 terabytes of telemetry data from late 2016. What it reveals is the cars, the vehicles that are driving around when they are out of service. However, we are able to then not only use that information to discern something about the out of service patterns, but based on where those data streams are kind of turning off and then reappearing, then we have the ability to actually infer where the actual trips that are carrying passengers are coming. But it does have some limitations. The trips are not directly observed. So for example, we have a relatively high degree of confidence in the spatial accuracy of where people are getting dropped off. We think that's probably pretty close to where they're actually getting dropped off. However, where people are getting picked up is actually where the driver is accepting a trip. Now, in some cases, that might be there might be some serious bias in that. Pre-COVID, if you have ever spent time in San Francisco in the last few years, you know that if you try to get an Uber or Lyft, they're basically, it's around the corner from you, essentially. There's a lot of vehicles on the street at any time. But another thing is that this is just patterns of TNC trips in time and space. We don't really know who is traveling in these vehicles, how many people, like the occupancy, how much people paid, for what purposes. So we did some supplementary data collection that helped us answer some of those questions. So what did we find? We've done a series of reports. These are all on our agency website, the first of which was called TNCs Today. And it was really just an attempt to say, what's out there on the ground? What's the existing conditions? Where are the trips happening? And what we found, and again, this is a few years ago, that there were at least 170,000 TNC trips in a typical day on San Francisco's streets. I say at least because we limited our frame to just trips that started and ended in San Francisco County. And that was due to the data collection. It would have been intractable for us to collect data on the entire Bay Area, which, that would have allowed us to track people who are, say, coming into San Francisco from the East Bay, Oakland or Berkeley, or from Silicon Valley down south, or from the airport. So we're just limited to within San Francisco trips, excuse me. And so it does represent a bit of a floor of the number of trips that were happening. But the numbers were still quite large. They represented about 15% of all intra-SF vehicle trips. In terms of the size of the market, at any given time of day, we estimate that there were about 13 times as many vehicles and TNC vehicles on the road as there were taxis. And they represented, by our estimates, about 9% of intra-SF person trips. Now, we've actually revised that number a little bit downward since then as we have gotten more data. I mentioned that VMT, vehicle miles traveled, is a critical metric that we use now for environmental quality assessments here in California. And in San Francisco, we estimated, based on the analysis that we did, that almost 600,000 vehicle miles of travel were being generated by TNCs on a typical weekday. And that was about 6.5% of the total VMT, and almost 20% of the intra-SF weekday VMT. So where and when are these trips happening? Well, what you see here on the right is a map. This is an interactive visualization. You can find it at the URL that's listed in that search bar at the top, the tncstoday.sfcta.org. It's pretty fun to play around with, so I would encourage you to go there. But you could really see, if you know what San Francisco is like, that the dark areas, that represents the places where there's the greatest intensity of usage, is the most congested part of the city. That's the core, that's the downtown, where there's actually a lot of transit service. It's very walkable and bikeable. There's a lot of non-motorized infrastructure. What we also found, and you can see this in the bar on the right-hand side of the visualization, is that these trips were not only happening in the most congested parts of the city, but at the most congested times of day. You can clearly see an AM peak and a PM peak. And the visualization allows you to go in and explore for any one of the zones that these data are aggregated to. You can look at the temporal distribution of trips to and from that zone. What you see in the lower left is some interesting stuff that had emerged and has actually since been validated in a number of other locations. This is actually a plot of TNC and taxi trips. TNCs are the black line, taxis are the yellow, and you can see the difference in the magnitude of trips. What we found here, there's a couple things that really jumped out. One is that, of course, we can see a typical diurnal pattern with a morning and an evening peak. But there are a couple things that really actually jumped out too, which is that there are a lot more trips happening on a Friday than on a Monday. And in fact, it kind of increases across the week, peaking on Friday. And then Saturday actually has quite a few trips as well. It doesn't have the same AM peak because folks aren't necessarily going to work. And then on Sunday, it drops off. So we're able to see that when we talk about TNC trips, they have very different distributions in space and time. And as you see in some of the subsequent slides, that has real impacts or influences on the impacts that they have on network performance. So one of the main questions, I would say this was the million-dollar question that most people wanted to understand was, do TNCs affect congestion in San Francisco? Again, our commissioners were saying, it looks like there's a lot of TNCs that are they affecting congestion? And there was a lot of theories out there, and there continue to be, that TNCs could actually decrease congestion. And how could they do that? Well, it could be that through sharing rides, we're actually getting more people, we're squeezing more people, moving more people out of fewer vehicles. So that actually might decrease congestion. Or it could be that by facilitating access to transit, that quote unquote first and last mile, that we'd actually could be inducing people to use transit for trips that they might have otherwise driven for rather. And then on a kind of a longer term scale, there have been theories that perhaps with the availability of on-demand vehicle services, that it would allow people to kind of reduce the number of autos that they own, that households own, and by virtue of that, induce them to make more non-motorized and transit trips. On the other hand, there's a lot of reasons why TNCs might increase congestion. First and foremost is that when we get into our personal vehicles, we typically drive from our origin to our destination. There might be a little bit of parking search time or something like that, but it's generally quite modest. With any kind of for-hire vehicle, there's always a deadheading component. And by that, I mean, when the vehicle is driving around, it doesn't have a passenger, so it's not actually, kind of adding a benefit. It's not moving anyone, but it is taking up road space and contributing to congestion. And there have been a number of studies that have tried to quantify the deadheading, and they've generally come in somewhere between 20 or 25% to up to 45 or 50% of all TNC miles are deadhead miles. So those could definitely increase congestion because they're really not, carrying folks around. It could be that they could increase congestion because they induce a mode shift not towards transit, but away from transit. And actually, there's been a number of studies that have since, documented this. In fact, the estimates are typically plus minus around 40% of all TNC trips were shifts from, biking, walking, transit, or were induced travel, trips that wouldn't have been made at all. And so that's a pretty big number, about 40% of those trips. And of course, even if somebody had used their private vehicle, they might actually, and now are taking a TNC, that private vehicle trip had much less deadhead miles. So even in the case where it's a shift from a a motor trip, a vehicular trip in a personal vehicle to a TNC, there's probably a net add in terms of congestion. And then finally, TNCs can disrupt traffic flow through pickup and drop-off activity. And again, if you were in San Francisco anytime in the last couple of years, undoubtedly you would have seen folks in the core, or if you were in the core in downtown or north of Market or Chinatown, where people are getting in and out of these vehicles, and then that queue piles up behind them, and that contributes to congestion as well. That said, there are a lot of other things that were happening in San Francisco at this time. There were changes to our roadway network, transit red carpet lanes, bike lanes, a couple major roadway infrastructure improvements. The connector, for example, from the Golden Gate Bridge to downtown was rebuilt. There was a tremendous population growth between 2010 and 2016, which was the time frame for our analysis. There were about 80 or 90,000 new residents in San Francisco, and there was incredible employment growth, something like 150,000 new jobs in San Francisco in just this 6-year time span. So when we talk about whether TNCs might affect congestion, we have to talk about all these other things to the extent that we can that might also be contributing to congestion. And I should have said at the outset, if you look on the right-hand side, this is our, I mentioned that we do roadway monitoring. This is the results from our congestion monitoring program from 2009 to 2017. The hotter, the reds and the orange represent much worse congestion. The greens and the yellows, less congestion. And you can see between 2009 and 2017 that whole northeastern quadrant just lit up. Congestion got a lot worse. I'd also note that this is an interactive visualization as well, that you can find at congestion.sfcta.org. And you can query any one of these individual links and it will tell you the trends over the last 30 years. So what did we find when we did this analysis of the contributions of TNCs to congestion relative to these other factors? Well, what we found is by 3 primary metrics of congestion, which are the change in delay. So this is basically the kind of additional time that people are spending in delay. This is a metric that economists love to use because it's kind of an economic inefficiency. The change in VMT, which is vehicle miles traveled, and again, this is a key metric that we use in California for environmental quality assessments. And change in speed, which is a very basic measure, but that's actually what we do as our monitoring as part of the congestion monitoring program. Whether you looked at it across any of these metrics, about half of the change in congestion between 2010 and 2016, we estimate was attributable to TNCs. About a quarter was attributable to population growth, about a quarter was attributable to employment growth, and very small amount, low single-digit percentage, was due to changes to the transportation network. But these impacts, as I mentioned before, just like the trips themselves aren't equally distributed in space and time, nor are the impacts of TNCs on congestion or these other factors equally distributed in space and time. So what we found was generally about, during the main parts of the day, early parts of the day, about 45 to 55% of the congestion, of the change in congestion, and here I'm showing you the change in speeds, was due to TNC. So again, on the y-axis here, you have the declines in speed. There are declines across all time periods. But interestingly, the most significant impacts on changes in speed were in the evening time period, which is from 6:30 in the morning until 6:30 in the evening until 3 the next morning, where we saw over on average, and this is citywide, over a 4 mile per hour drop in average speeds in the evening during just this 6-year time period. And about 3/4 of that was due to TNC activity. We also found that, and I didn't include this, that the changes varied in space as well. So what we found was in regions like, or parts of the city like the South of Market, for example, which again, if you're familiar with San Francisco, has just been an epicenter of huge towers going up, lots of population growth, lots of employment growth. There was a huge amount of additional delay that accrued in that district. But as it turns out, about 40% of it was due to TNC, so a little bit less than half. Interestingly, just across Market Street, if you went into typically the North Beach and Chinatown districts, we saw less actual increase, about half the same. I think it was about 6,000 hours of delay per day north of Market. But the vast majority of that, something again like 75% or more, was attributable to TNCs. However, if you went out to some of the western districts in the city, like the Sunset District, which is close to the ocean, there was very little increase in congestion, and TNCs were responsible for very little of that change. We also looked at other questions. So I mentioned before, of course, now in the COVID era, transit is facing some rather profound challenges as well. This analysis that I'm about to briefly describe to you is around what we looked at in how TNCs affect transit ridership before the COVID era. So this looked at that same time frame, 2010 to about 2015, 2016. And these were the results of kind of panel regression models, where we looked at a slightly different set of explanatory variables. They included things like changes in accessibility by transit, the number of routes that serve different areas of the city. The TAZs stands for Travel Analysis Zone. They're basically, 1 to 6 block geographies within San Francisco County. There's about 1,000 in San Francisco County, so they're rather small. How many trip stops, how much service is being provided, the on-time performance of that service, whether there's competing services in nearby areas, the effects of major rail, regional rail on ridership, as well as the location of and timing of TNC activities. And this analysis that you see here is what we call is a distillation of some of the findings from that panel regression model. And it basically allows us to say, of the changes that we saw, how much is attributable to each one of these factors? And so this is Muni bus ridership. You can see it didn't grow very much at the bottom. Total ridership was about 480,000 between both these years. So it was relatively flat. But there were certain factors that were actually driving up ridership, things like changes in accessibility. There's a lot more people, there are a lot more jobs. Muni put a lot more service out there on the streets. All of these things had a positive effect on raising and should have, we should have seen rising transit ridership. But TNCs themselves essentially kind of consumed all of that, so that while these other factors would have, absent the presence and arrival of TNCs, we expect to see about a 10% increase in transit over this period. In fact, TNCs reduced the ridership by about 10%, and thus the ridership was generally flat. I mentioned before, equity is a real critical concern for us in San Francisco County. But the original TNCs Today data set that we were able to collaborate with the Northeastern University researchers on didn't have any information on who was traveling or for what purposes or what those vehicle occupancies are. So we did an additional travel diary survey. And that travel diary survey was something that was done both in San Francisco and across the whole Bay Area. Ultimately included, this was in 2019 primarily, it included about 5,000 participants. It was a random address-based sample. Users or participants downloaded an app, the RMove survey, which is from a company called Resource Systems Group. It followed the app followed them around for a week. It tracked every trip that folks made. Those folks through the app reported the purposes for their travel, who they were traveling with, what mode, etc. It also prompted them for some interesting other questions, like what if they got into it in a TNC, would they have made the trip absent a TNC being available? And if they would have made the trip, what mode they would have used? So we can get at some of those mode shifts and quantify those very specifically. But of course, it included a range of demographic variables as well. So I'll give you a couple, just like highlights from some of the survey findings with respect to who is using TNCs, because there's actually some interesting stuff that's happening. We categorized folks into 3 bins of usage. One was across the entire week, they had no TNC trips. And maybe I should actually, one final note I should mention is that while it was a random address-based sample, which was necessary for us to be able to kind of expand it properly to represent what's happening in the entire, both in San Francisco and in the entire region, we did do stratified sampling. So we oversampled in areas that we expected had households that were going to use TNCs more, so that we scoop up a little bit more of those TNC trips, but could still account for that and weight that properly when expanding the survey. After doing that, we actually found that we when we looked at all of the patterns for people across this entire week of data that they shared, we categorized people into 3 bins. One was that they didn't use TNCs at all during the week. One was that they had low usage, which was an average of less than 1 TNC trip per day. And high was folks who were making on average 1 or more trips on TNCs per day. And so what you see here is a split that shows TNC usage by income level. What you see on the left is for non-San Francisco. So that's folks who are not in San Francisco County. On the right is San Francisco County. And you can generally see, I think this is rather interesting, there isn't as clear a pattern when we look at non-San Francisco parts of the region. There are folks in the low and high bins, both at the low end of the economic scale and at the higher end. Whereas in San Francisco County, we see a little bit more of a clear pattern where TNCs are generally serving higher income folks. The pattern with age was a little bit more consistent across both the region and San Francisco County. And actually, just to provide a little bit of context, I didn't put in any of these numbers earlier. There are by our estimates, about as many trips just happening in San Francisco, which is about 49 square miles and has about 12% of the region's population, as there are in the rest of the Bay Area, which is thousands of square miles and has about 7.2 million people or so. So there really is a concentration of the TNC activity in San Francisco County and city. As I said a moment ago, though, the pattern with respect to age was pretty consistent both across the region and within San Francisco, which is that generally younger people were using them more frequently. And you can really see, striking patterns of almost 20% of folks in some of these lower age brackets were using TNCs, relatively frequently. We didn't see like a lot of clear trends with respect to usage by race and ethnicity. And this is something that we also discovered when we did a geographic analysis on the original TNCs Today data set, which is that TNCs were serving, people across all sorts of different neighborhoods with very different ethnographic makeups in San Francisco County. And that seems to be borne out by the survey data that we have now. So I'll try and wrap it up now. I've been talking for too long already. Why is data important? Well, data is important because it really can affect policy. So as a outcome of the work that we have been doing that's demonstrated that there are impacts on, for example, congestion as a result of TNCs, San Francisco voters actually voted to impose a 3.5% tax on TNC trips for congestion relief. So there's now money that's flowing in to help invest in non-motorized infrastructure, to collect data, to monitor, to improve transit. The size of the TNC market, being able to say something about how big it is and how maybe concentrated or unconcentrated it is in different areas or at different times of day, has really prompted other agencies in our region for sure to start to think about how they need to incorporate TNCs into their forecasting tools, because there are a lot of policy ideas out there about how TNCs might be able to, for example, provide first last mile service, just as a for instance. And so they really want to begin to be able to quantify that. As a little bit of a sidebar, our survey data, the travel diary survey, which ultimately included about 130 to 140,000 trips, we found that less than 1% of TNC trips were being used to access or egress transit. So not of all trips, just of TNC trips, less than 1% were access or egress to transit. And that's like a very, very small fraction of all of the trips in the region. Other changes are that, as a result of some of that initial work, that transportation and land use development projects are now actually subject to more kind of rigorous analysis, specifically around ride hailing and TNCs. And perhaps most remarkably, San Francisco is, again, our agency is now looking at congestion pricing again. This is something we looked at around 2010. There wasn't a whole lot of appetite for it because subsequently there was the kind of market crash. But then as congestion has come back, there was a lot more interest in that. Of course, we've been suffering through tremendous kind of economic upheaval lately. But it is really anticipated that even as the economy slowly starts to come back, some of the reluctance of people to jump back onto transit is actually affecting, causing more folks to be driving. And in fact, while the last couple of weeks it's gotten a little bit better, about a month ago, many of our key roadway congestion metrics were almost the same as they were prior to the onset of COVID and all of the associated changes with travel, which is really striking because, as we know, there's a lot fewer people going to work, either by virtue of the misfortune of lower employment or higher unemployment, as well as the fact that people are working from home much more now. And there have been also things like shelter in place and reductions in the types of other non-work activities that people are participating in, but we're still seeing congestion roar back. So congestion pricing may be something that we find is going to be useful for managing this as well. To try and wrap things up, how should we get data? Well, I think one thing is we really need regulatory frameworks that reflect where impacts can occur and the types of impacts that are occurring. And we need data to be able to understand that. So again, like there's a number of initiatives that are going on right now. Say, for example, the Clean Mile Standard. This is some legislation that was intended to induce fleets, the TNC fleets, to transition to zero emission vehicles. There are all sorts of exceptions and all that sort of stuff about where and when they can, get credits for things. But one of the challenges is that our data, as our data has revealed, a huge share of the trips, certainly in the Bay Area, that are just happening in this tiny area called San Francisco. But investments could be made where there really are no impacts, in low density or residential areas, say for adding bike infrastructure, that really wouldn't do anything to help mitigate the effects in San Francisco. And then finally, developing interagency data sharing guidelines that address trade secret or privacy concerns are, I think, really critical. We spend literally millions of dollars to collect relatively small samples of data when there's just a huge wealth of information that's already being reported to the state that hasn't been shared with us. As I mentioned earlier, I'm cautiously optimistic that that landscape may be changing, but as yet we haven't seen some of that more detailed data that would be so useful. What types of data did agencies want? Quite honestly, aggregate data is less useful. If you get zip code level information on TNC trips, that's not going to be able to tell you anything about those first last mile access. Our TNC supporting transit won't help you really say too much about congestion or about transit impacts, disrupting flow, safety. At the same time, we really do need to recognize that there are personally identifiable information potentially in some of this, and we need to acknowledge and manage that. But of course, this isn't something that's new. We've been collecting, as probably many people on this call know, we've been collecting detailed travel diary surveys with precise point locations for decades, and that really hasn't been an issue. Or if we think about the types of data that public institutions such as hospitals maintain, there's lots of precedent for how the public can safely guard private data. So, where are we going? We're continuing to identify what we think are the key policy questions. We're trying to get more required data reporting. Ideally, this would be using a common data standard. MDS is one that was developed by LADOT. A lot of people have concerns about it. I will say that SFMTA, our partner agency, is using it for their data standard for their micromobility. They actually don't share any of the MDS data. They do aggregation so that it can be publicly available. We do need to make sure that we address privacy concerns and data sharing concerns. And one thing that we're doing is we're trying to collaborate more with other public agencies. We've been working with the quote unquote 4 big MPOs in California to do joint data collection. And we're now working with other counties and the MPO, the Metropolitan Planning Organization for the Bay Area, MTC, to do joint data collection in the Bay Area. I've included a couple slides, a slide here of some of the reports and visualizations we've done. This actually isn't complete. As I mentioned before, we have congestion.sfcta.org is where you can look at all our monitoring data. We actually have the COVID-congestion.sfcta.org, which is now not every 2 years, but every week we update that data. We also include weekly estimates of changes in VMT and so on. So there's a wealth of data at our website, and I would encourage you to go there. And with that, I'm sorry I went on a little bit longer than I expected. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. It was a very detailed explanation and presentation. So maybe there are not too many questions and we can keep on time. But let's start. Okay, there are some questions coming up. Let's start with the questions that I got from the email, right?
Yes.
Do you know if somebody is doing some curbside management strategies to explore the mitigation of TNCs
Yeah.
affecting congestion?
So absolutely. And so, SFMTA, I mentioned I work for SFCTA. We also have SFMTA. And SFMTA are the folks who actually manage the streets and run the transit system in San Francisco. And they're in charge of managing the curb. And they have recognized, that there really is this really profound challenge that we face right now with using the curb differently than we have. And that really is a public good that we need to more positively manage. And so they have been working on a curb management strategy and policy that more explicitly addresses the increased demand for curb access, not just for TNCs, but certainly also for the kind of growth in delivery services, as well as, we anticipate, AVs and AVTNCs. So it's kind of a half answer is that, yes, there is an agency in San Francisco that is working on this policy and is responsible for implementing it, but as yet has not yet rolled it out.
Okay, thank you. Let's go with the questions in the chat. Siwi, do you want to unmute yourself or I can ask the question?
Yeah, you can help me.
Okay. So the question is, as TNC service grows, employment and population also grow. And the question is, how can we know whether the congestion impacts comes from the TNCs or from the population? I guess it refers to the diagrams with the percentages.
Yeah, sure. So the way that we did this was we actually used both observed data on the TNC trips, and we combined that with information from our travel demand forecast model. So we have a very detailed, in San Francisco, we have a very detailed activity-based travel demand forecasting model. So what I mean by that is it's a simulation model. It represents, we generate a synthetic population, and then we predict for every minute of the day where people are going to be. What activities they're going to be participating in, where those activities are located, what modes, the timing of their participation, and the modes that they use to get to those activities. So it's extremely detailed. And what we were able to do with the model is to essentially do a kind of a counterfactual to say like, hey, if in 2016 TNCs did not exist, what would the landscape have looked like? And then with the TNCs added, what did it look like? And that's the basis by which we were able to estimate these. There's a paper that was, a number of papers that documented the methodology. In fact, at the end, I think I included a link to, it was published in Science Advances, I think in May of last year. But the model has been used extensively for land use impact analysis, transportation investment analysis, and a fair amount of time and effort is invested in making sure that it is, well calibrated and validated to represent existing conditions or baseline conditions so that we can have confidence in its estimates.
Okay, great, thank you. The next question is from Professor Michael Hyland.
Jill, thank you very much for the presentation. I actually have a follow-up question, if you don't mind, about that study. Did you do you have a dynamic traffic assignment model, or did you just use like VMT coming out of the ABM model?
Yeah, so we actually do have also a dynamic traffic assignment model. At the time, we did not use it. We used our standard static, the activity-based model has as a component of it a traditional, static assignment model. It's pretty detailed in San Francisco in that it represents, all of the facilities. But the changes in congestion and VMT were estimated, based on that more traditional static assignment model. The way that we actually, though, can look at it, it did allow us, even with because we had the both, essentially the out of service and in service information, and the out of service traces explicitly the in service volumes implicitly, we could actually look at, for each individual link for every street in the city, how much of the volume was due to out of service, in service, and even could estimate the amount of additional delay that was associated with the pickup and drop off activity as well. So it was, while acknowledging the limitations of static models, we were able to actually derive some pretty good information from it. I will say that actually subsequent to that, we have actually developed as a proof of concept a regional scale DTA, which uses the same activity-based model demand, all with that really fine-grained spatial and temporal detail, and then applies it regionally so that we assign all that demand to the DTA. It uses the Dynamec software by INRO. Dynamec then just, we were able to generate temporally detailed skims from the DTA results and feed those back into our activity-based model. So we've been trying to advance our network modeling capabilities as well.
Great, that's great. And then my original question, you had mentioned that traffic had kind of gotten back to near pre-COVID levels a couple of weeks ago. And kind of anecdotally around here, we've, I guess, seen similar things, but it seems like speeds have not grown in the same way VMT has, likely because people were spreading the trip. So I'm just wondering, have both speeds and VMT got to pre-COVID levels, or just VMT?
No, it's interesting that you should add that. What we've observed so far is, when I say a metric of overall average speed, we have seen the average speeds dip back down to now. And actually, maybe what I can do, if I escape this, let me see if I can, if you'll bear with me for one moment, if I can stop sharing, and I'll show you the tool that we have been using. And one of the reasons why I'd like to show it to you is because number one, it is all open source. So if any of you want to pick up and run with it. So are you able to see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, so this is what we call, you can see the URL at the top, covid.congestion.sfcta. This data is all driven by INRIX. So MTC has a regional license for INRIX. Every week, we grab all of the data for San Francisco. We process it into these time periods. We could use other time periods, but we do the AM and PM. We have the pipeline for doing all of that data processing is all open source as well. You can find it on our agency GitHub site. The code for all of the visualization is also all open source. You can also find that on our agency GitHub site. But you can see here, so for example, these are the trends. This is the AM. I'll switch over to the PM. So this was right here. This was back in March 3rd. Our average freeway speeds were about 26 miles an hour, and our arterial speeds were about 12.5. After shelter in place, the freeway speeds jumped up to 60 miles an hour in the PM, which was incredible. And you can see all the way up until about a few weeks ago, early November, the freeway speeds had dropped down to 34.7 miles per hour, which is just about where they were right before the full shelter in place. And so that's what I say when we almost reverted, certainly in the PM, to where we have been before. We've actually seen speeds going up a little bit later, more recently, as I think people have begun to limit their travel once again. The tool has a couple nice features, though. You can actually, of course, look at any of this. You can look at speed changes relative to pre-COVID. And something that we've added just recently, and again, for any one of these, and I don't mean to be giving a sales job on this, but it's all open source. So if anybody wanted to pick up and run with this, they could. You can select any link and it'll actually give you the speed profile over time. One thing that we've just added, and getting good information on VMT is really challenging. Caltrans puts out a report on VMT, comes out every year, but there's like a 2-year lag, and it's county level data. It's not really super disaggregate, but we use that as a calibration target. We've actually been using, and I will admit that this is imperfect, but it's the best that we can do at this point. We actually use and reverse calculate, kind of flip around our volume delay function to estimate VMT from the speeds that we're observing. And so this is something we've just added. So before COVID, we had a calibration target of about 10 million vehicle miles traveled per day. It started to nose up back to about 8. We've seen it kind of nose down a little bit more recently. Again, not by no means a perfect estimate, but our partner agencies, SFMTA, were really interested in a aggregate VMT metric. So this is how we, attempted to respond to that request.
Great. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Let's have maybe one last question because of the time. Yohung maybe says, like, in some countries, regular taxis have also app-based call service, and that would be similar to the TNCs. The price as a result of competition will go low, even more so when autonomous vehicles are around. And would it be possible to control the demand just with the tax, or how do you think will happen in the relatively distant future?
Well, despite the fact that my job is forecasting, there are certain areas in which I want to be very kind of cautious about what I say, but also honest. One of the things that we've seen that has been a big difference in the transition, say, from taxis to TNCs, and that will continue with AVs, is that when taxis were regulated at the local jurisdictional level, there was a limit on the number. It was about 2,000 taxi medallions in San Francisco. When TNCs came online, there was actually no limit on the number of drivers who could, sign up with a TNC and start driving. And that's when we saw, something like up to 40,000 people register in San Francisco as, basically to providing driving services. And as our research showed, and this is a few years ago, at any given time, there was something like 15,000 or more TNC vehicles operating on San Francisco streets. Interestingly, when we looked at the origins of the kind of where people register their businesses, only about 30% of those people, and that's actually been validated in subsequent surveys, were from San Francisco. So we actually had about 70% of the people who were driving on San Francisco streets were coming into San Francisco to do that driving. Well, why were they doing that? Because the nature of the business is that, there's just a lot more, there's a density of trip activity. So you can essentially make a lot more money, and there's a lot shorter distances, so you're not wasting gas than, serving some more suburbanized areas of the city, of the region, where there's going to be less density of trips, more costs associated with serving those trips. And so what we've seen is in an unrestricted kind of supply side, that the brunt of the impacts are borne, kind of in the urbanized areas. And interestingly, I mentioned with AVs, with the deployment permits that are now, the CPUC's decision making is now on the cusp of really kind of releasing onto our streets. There's similarly no cap. So we really, at present, I think we can expect to continue to see, a flood of vehicles into the city. It is certainly it could be a policy choice to attempt to constrain the number of vehicles that are either the total number of vehicles that are operating or the total number that are operating in a particular time or particular space. But presently, we don't have any kind of regulatory authority to do any of that. The TNC tax is a very small step to try and say, well, if there are going to be all these impacts, at least let's try and generate some revenues that we can attempt to implement some mitigation strategies. But it's really, frankly, kind of weak tea given the magnitude of the problem. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. And I don't want you to give anybody more time than necessary. So maybe if you have more questions, you can contact Joe directly, or I'll be saving the questions on the chat box and send them to him. And thank you very much for attending, everybody. It has been a pleasure and very exciting presentation. And some bad news, but it's good to know so that we can improve traffic, right? So.
Yeah, well, thank you all for taking the time to hear my spiel. And it's a pleasure to get a chance to talk to you again. Again, please don't hesitate to reach out to me if you have any questions. I'd be happy to engage. And I hope maybe sometime we'll have the opportunity to work together.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.